Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this QA at 25 event today. We're just watching people trickle through. If we can hit, I think rather than keep people waiting, people are beginning to come through now. I will, with great pleasure, hand over to QA's Chief Executive Officer, Vicky Stott, who is going to host today's session. I do hope that you'll have lots of interesting questions for Julia after she's given her presentation. But with great pleasure, I hand over to Vicky now. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Steph, and welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to see so many of you. And welcome to the penultimate conversation marking QAA's 25th anniversary year. Regulation is a lively topic of discourse within the higher education sector, particularly in England. QAA are ourselves a regulator of the Level 3 access to higher education qualification, and we will, until the end of March next year, have a role in the statutory regulatory arrangements in England. Over the quarter of a century of QAA's existence, we've seen significant changes of policy and direction, but predominantly regulation has taken place through the medium of the Funding Council's arrangements. But in the early to mid part of the last decade, regulation through administrative means was how our sector would experience regulatory oversight. But that could only ever go so far, and inevitably it led to the legislative changes we saw in 2017 and the subsequent 2018 changes to the regulatory framework. So for the sector and for QAA, having a public body that has the regulatory remit and functions we see embodied in the Office for Students is still something that's a relatively recent development, certainly in comparison to the length of time some higher education providers have operated in England. And we can see from the regulator's changes to its regulatory requirements, particularly in quality and standards over the past couple of years, that the regulatory approach is still being refined and being shaped. So it doesn't seem particularly late to be addressing the question, what is regulation for, and how does or how could it work? What theories underpin regulation, and what good practice can be gleaned from other industry sectors that might be of relevance to us in higher education? How can and should the regulated, the providers in England, be able to influence and engage with the regulator? As we turn 25, those would seem to be important questions to consider, and I'm really thrilled that we have an expert on regulation with us today to help us explore some of these questions. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Julia Black. Julia is a professor in law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her primary research interest is in the dynamics and legitimacy of regulatory regimes, with a specialisation in financial services regulation and in the regulation of risk. She has published widely on issues relating to regulation and has advised a range of government and consumer bodies in the UK and overseas on issues of institutional design and regulatory policy. And she is currently the Strategic Director of Innovation at LSE. Julia also has a range of external activities which include President of the British Academy, external member of the Prudential Regulation Committee and the Financial Markets Infrastructure Board at the Bank of England, board member of the UK Research and Innovation and the Courtauld Institute of Art, a member of the Council on the Science and Technology Committee, and a director of Zinc, a mission-based incubator. And so, Julia, we're very much looking forward to what you've got to say today. Please, I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Vicky. And thank you very much for inviting me along to be part of your 25th birthday. That's very exciting. I hope there's cake. I hope there's been cake, lots of cake and candles. So listen, very good to be with you this afternoon. And I've been asked to come and speak, as Vicky said, that the regulatory context within higher education, as you know, certainly in England, is quite new, is evolving. And I think there are, one of the reasons that QAA, I think, have asked me to speak today, I think there's quite a lot that we can learn from other sectors in terms of how regulatory systems can work, what regulation might be for. And I'll touch a little bit on what regulation might be for, but I'm going to concentrate my remarks mainly on regulatory dynamics, the dynamics between the regulator and the regulatee. Bit of a clunky word, but it's quite useful incorporating all sorts of different organizations that might be regulated, and what affects those dynamics, and how we design regulation, and how that impacts on how those different dynamics might play out. So I'll aim to, I could talk for days, to be frank, on regulation, but I'll aim to keep it quite brief, and then hopefully we can just have some time for questions and discussions. So I'm just going to do that very scary thing that you do as a presenter, and boldly share my screen, and hope that you can then see that. So hopefully you can see that now. Anyway, somebody can shout at me if you can't.
Yeah,
so
that's perfect.
That's perfect, brilliant. So, so to start off, before we move into dynamics, we can think about, well, what is regulation for? And back in, I suppose, the academic study, the practice of regulation began on for centuries, but the academic study of regulation really took off in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s, and it was very much associated at that time with the privatization of utilities. And so very economic in focus, in other words, and so, and very associated with, quite a neoliberal agenda, which said, well, the goal of regulation is to correct market failure. And market failure is also bound the limits of the state. Regulation is in this context, I'll talk about as a state activity. It can be self-regulatory. You can have lots of different organizations, in fact, doing regulation. But in terms of the justification for regulation by the state, the argument was you need to correct a market failure so that markets work in theoretically in accordance with a theoretical model of efficient markets, which is that you have competition, you have lots of providers, you have supply and demand determining your prices, you've got everybody's got perfect information, everybody's got perfect foresight, and everybody's preferences are pretty stable and consistent. And regulation needs to come in when those things aren't in place. So if people aren't providing information, you need to provide information, etc. But we all know, to be honest, it's that was quite dominant. But in fact, as I said before, regulations had a much stronger, much longer history, and in particular associated with industrialization and the rise of risks. So we've had regulation for risk and to manage risk for a very long time, whether it be on passenger boats that were traveling, when people were migrating over to the US, actually, in 19th century regulation coming in there. We've had food regulation for actually some considerable time. We've had medical regulation of different forms, all about managing risk. And then increasingly, as different mandates shift, other more value-based assessments of why we need regulation. So I was at one point on the board of the Solicitors Regulation Authority. It regulates solicitors, regulates the profession, and one of our statutory duties was to ensure that our regulatory system enabled the rule of law to be upheld. That's quite a big thing. And obviously, once we start getting into issues around, as we do in the quality space, around quality or wanting good outcomes, then we start to get into a space which isn't quite so easy to define in terms of a pure economic approach or even a pure risk approach. These really are qualitative judgments which are made because of a value that we hold quite dear. And as a society, through a democratic process in state regulation, have decided we need to introduce regulation. And I would say that in terms of, as I turn now to think about regulatory dynamics, what are we doing, or if it's state regulation or self-regulation, what are we actually trying to achieve through a regulatory system? And my answer is always along these lines. Essentially, we're trying to change people's behavior, or the behavior of organizations or firms, change behaviors so that we achieve a certain set of outcomes, which the group defines as being good outcomes. So we want to change those behaviors. We want to move those behaviors And because they need changing, that suggests that people aren't naturally going to perform these behaviors. So we need to change behaviors, change people from doing what they're doing now to what they wouldn't otherwise do without this external prompt. And we need to make sure that behavioral change is sustained even when no one's looking, right? Because you can't always look as a regulator. So it is all around behavioral change, even if you're talking about the regulation of the technology. Those are designed by people, built by people, managed by people. So that regulatory dynamic between the regulator and those who are being regulated is absolutely critical to actually how a regulatory regime operates, a regulatory system operates. And that's what I'm just going to focus on this afternoon. I want to look at it as sort of about both ends of the telescope, as it were. So to explore these, and then we can be thinking about how they're playing out, perhaps in the educational context. So look from the regulator to firms, providers. What does the world look like from a regulator's point of view? Looking down, if you like, and then perhaps looking up from providers to the regulator. You know, what does the world look like from that point of view? And I'm conscious that for most people on the call, it'll be that latter perspective, which is more familiar. But there may be a bunch of regulators on the call as well. So let's have a look at, and obviously people move between the two in terms of their different roles. So people are often at different ends of that telescope at different points in their career. So let's have a quick look. And I say I'm really, really quick canter through the view from the regulators. So if you're a regulator, you've got a number of challenges, which can include, first of all, if you're a statutory regulator, the breadth and coherence of your legislative mandate. Might be clear, most likely it's become a bit of a Christmas tree with various things that the regulator needs to achieve. They may pull against one another. They may not begin the hierarchy in the legislation. Usually then a bunch of have regards to, so different considerations that the regulator has to have regard to. There's some housekeeping things there in terms of regulatory hygiene, in terms of proportionality, efficiency, etc. Now added in net zero, energy security, economic growth, and I, as Vicky mentioned, I have a regulatory role at the Bank of England. In relation to one of the sets of powers we have to exercise there, we have 23 different factors to which we have to have regard. So breadth and coherence of mandate. Then you've got nature and extent of your powers. So does the regulator actually have a power in legislation to go in and address a problem? Does it have adequate powers? Does it have adequate powers to make rules, to issue enforcement actions, to collect information, to collect data, to actually regulate this activity in the first place? Are all the rules set in primary legislation? So you need a whole legislative process in order to change them. How in control is a regulator of its own standards, etc. Then you've got to think about its capacity and its resources. So financial resources, data, ability to manage data, its IT systems, staff, expertise in quite a number of different sectors. Then the industry pays much more than being a regulator, and so competition for talent can be quite critical. And this and governments in effect can denude, as it were, regulatory agencies of capacity and resources by just not funding them. So there's a lot of criticism in relation to the Environment Agency, for example, at the moment, in relation to its ability to monitor the health and of water courses, that it just doesn't have the staff or the powers to be able to do that effectively. Regulated population, usually quite mixed, even if small, could be huge. Health and safety executive is every workplace in the land. If you move into higher education, it's a smaller number, but it is going to vary between the big multinationals down to the very, very small operators. And usually, very rule of thumb, kind of 20% of the scale of the businesses, so that 20% of firms by size, or operators by size, will account for about 80% of the market. So then you've usually got this long tail of quite small operators. So you've got to, as a regulator, you've got to think about how you're going to manage that. It's got lots of conflicting expectations from firms, providers, consumers, politicians as to what regulators should and shouldn't be able to do. One thing you know for sure is you're always going to get blamed when something goes wrong, even if you have nothing to do with it, even if it wasn't your fault, you're probably going to get blamed. So don't go into regulation unless you're prepared for that. But it does then play into what it is people are expecting from the regulator in terms of what it is that regulator, how that regulatory system is meant to be operating. And then basically regulators have very limited resources. We all have limited resources. No matter how many resources you have, you're going to have to think about how to manage those. And regulators have a choice. Do they give every operator, as it were, the same treatment on a kind of routine audit basis? We just do our annual audit of everybody at the, basically in the same way, or to have a much more targeted risk-based approach. So how do you sort of balance these? So those operators which pose the biggest risk to our objectives, do we give them more attention, give more resources to them? What does that mean when something goes wrong in the tail and our reputation is damaged? How do we balance all of those different things? So that's a bit of a view from the regulators. You could argue a bit of a violin possibly could be playing in the background when we talk about that, but it is a pretty complex landscape, as you can tell. And regulators sometimes, to make sense of that sort of very heterogeneous regulated population, either implicitly or explicitly, can characterize them in terms of risk that they pose to their objectives. So what's the impact of something going wrong in that provider, and what's the probability of something going wrong? So that's a sort of more technical assessment. But they can also characterize them more subjectively. Now, I have known regulators who have actually characterized their regulatees and put them into different buckets in a formal way, but quite often this is done quite informally. And I've grouped them into two dimensions here, which is first of all to do with intention. What's this provider's intention vis-a-vis the regulation? And then secondly, what's their capacity to comply? Sometimes this is talked about in terms of, are they informed? But actually we know in order to comply or get your organization to change its ways or to behave in a certain way, get people to do that, quite a lot of organizational capacity required in that in terms of systems, processes, cultures, etc. So just very broadly, just on a little nice 2x2 matrix, you can have the well-intentioned, high capacity provider, and I call those a compliance leader. So from a regulator, you can use your alignment to, they want to do the right thing, they agree with the values, they agree with the goals, and they've gone through the compliance calculus and think, no, this is what we need to do. So a compliance leader. And then you've got those who might be well-intentioned, but in fact just have low capacity. So there's often, not always, but often just a smaller end of the providers. So basically they're just struggling to keep the place going, keep the lights on, and turning attention to regulation in any deep or meaningful sense would be a nice to have, but they just can't do that because of the limitations on their resources overall. So I call those a compliance struggler. So you struggle to comply, well-meaning, but just can't quite get there. And then you've got the ill-intentioned. Obviously, this is all quite binary, and in reality, things are on a spectrum, and people might be well-disposed to some bit of regulation and ill-disposed to another bit, but let's just keep it simple for the moment. Then you've got the ill-intentioned. Then you've got those who are high capacity, however, so they're really well-organized. So if they just, and I call those a compliance entrepreneur. So they can basically kind of comply creatively. Creative compliance is known as in the literature. Sort of comply with the letter, but not the spirit of the rule. They know the loopholes. They know how to get around it. They know how to kind of delay. They know how to tell the regulator not. So they're very skilled at deciding how they're going to comply, when they're going to comply, and what they're going to comply with. So that's your compliance entrepreneur. And then, to be honest, there are those who are they're not just not interested. They don't want to be regulated. They're also pretty small. If they did have any resources to throw at this, they're not going to do so. And so I just call it a compliance denier. And I used to do a bit of work with the environmental regulators. It was always pig farmers. There may be some lovely pig farmers out there who are obviously compliance leaders. I wouldn't obviously want to sort of slam the whole profession, but those who actually just don't want to know. So I throw that out there so you can all also think, which boxes you might be fitting in there. But the point of view from a regulator's point of view is that arguably each group, as it were, and I've just given 4 sets there, needs a slightly different approach. Compliance leaders, you can probably leave and use them, as it were. The compliance strugglers, you'll need more of an education approach, more of a supportive approach. The compliance entrepreneurs, you need to be really, they'll respond to deterrence, they'll respond to things that affect their business model. And the compliance denier, you might need a bit of education, but again, it's more of a deterrence approach, which conventionally will be one which is possibly more appropriate. But that's only, and then as you can see, this is how I've sort of moved into now, is how regulators might respond to non-compliance, as they, depending on how they might have characterized their regulatees. And this is a very famous model from 1992, a couple of academics call it, Ian Hayes and John Braithwaite, which is basically fairly self-evident, fairly common sense, to be honest, that as regulators engage, they sort of move through a compliance approach, getting people working with firms, then to warnings and then to sanctions. But in fact, depending on the behavior of the firm, if they're really playing that kind of compliance entrepreneur game, they might just move straight to sanctions. And if they're a struggler, they may spend more time on the compliance approach in this kind of tit-for-tat dynamic and relationship. But the other thing that affects how regulate, so that's on the regulator side. So let's now turn to the regulatee side, thinking about where one might be in those different boxes of the regulatee. And I think it's important to think about also how the design of regulation impacts on how regulatees themselves might want to respond, or might be able to respond, or might need to respond, and what kind of calls it makes on organizational capacity. And there are different modes of regulation. To be honest, I've just given us 4 here. 4 is plenty to be going on with. But just so to sort of draw out really some examples of what I mean here, to give it some illustrations. So the first is you can have through your rules, very detailed rules that high specification of processes, or bright line rules, which are usually kind of speed limits, including kind of quantitatively defined outcomes. So those nice OFS B3 conditions, for example, on continuation rates of, everybody divided up into these subcategories and subcategories and subcategories. So a highly detailed, highly specific, can be process orientated, can be to achieve an outcome, as I said. Or you might have within the regulatory system a bunch of quantitative models. So I work a lot, for example, with in the banking sector, we rely on models to model risk, and then to say how much capital, or basically money in easy words, that banks and insurance companies need to set aside based on the calculations that come out of those models. Calculative models obviously hugely important if you're talking about anything to do with engineering, if you're talking anything to do with nuclear safety, if you're talking anything to do with seas, aeroplanes, drones, etc. So calculative quantitative models, or in pricing rules for utility or climate models for net zero targets. I'll skip over those because they're not so relevant in our sector, but still good to know them there. Moving back to rules, your rules can be detailed or they can be principles-based regulation. So regulation, which is where the requirements are defined in quite general terms, like, as I say, fair, reasonable, quality, timely, appropriate, absolutely methods of judgment. And I'll come back to the capacity demands that makes on both regulator and regulatee in a minute. And linked to, but not identical to, is outcomes-focused regulation. So the two might overlap. So if your outcome is defined in terms of excellent education, fair outcomes, safe, or they may, your principles might be more around a process, treat customers fairly, for example. The point being that they're quite general, they're quite open-ended, and they are qualitative in nature. So let's think about the different demands that each poses on everybody who needs to try and comply with those. So take these detailed versus open-ended rules to start off with. So if you've got a detailed, first of all, you've got different demands on interpretation, different levels of what I call interpretive risk. In other words, the risk as a regulatee, your interpretation of what a good outcome is or quality is might not align with that of the regulator, and you might get sanctioned as a result, which is a level of interpretive risk. So you've got different demands on interpretation, from a detailed rule saying, you know, achieve this number, or follow this process meticulously, to, you know, achieve, just do whatever you need to do to get a good outcome, give a high quality education. And what that means also is you then have different demands on your staff in both regulator and regulatee, because you've got to be able to, for both, to actually be quite skilled, to be able to articulate what a good outcome is from both perspectives in any particular circumstance. And it also plays into the dynamics of the conversation, both internally within a provider and organisation, about what the organisation should be doing in order to comply, and between a regulator and the regulatee. So it's quite easy. So let's take on a provider, and you're kind of, you know, head of compliance or the equivalent, and there's always some need for more resources, or for the organisation to change its systems in some way. It's quite easy if you go into your senior team at the top table and say, oh, but listen, rule 3.4.x demands that we have following processes in place, and for me to do that, I need the following resources. It's a very different conversation to go into the senior team and say, well, the regulation achieves us to achieve good outcomes. We think as a team a good outcome requires us to have this particular system or something in place. And then they'll push back saying, oh, but does it really? Let's have and so you've got a very different kind of dynamic going on internally, also to get people to comply. And the same goes between the regulator and the regulatee. You've got a much more discursive relationship, arguably, if you're really making this work, if you're doing what I call full substantive principles-based regulation, then it does have to come along with that dialogue. But also then what we know from all of these principles, it looks fine, but then actually it gets lots further specifications, endless handbooks get developed internally. And so what by design comes out as principles-based regulation is felt internally within organisations. There's actually a high degree of specification and internal bureaucracy, which then gets blamed on the regulatory system, obviously. Other things, if you've got high degrees of process specification, that works quite well where you've got routines. So role of checklists prove to be very, very important in medical settings, for example, in operations, in operation theatres, in aviation. There's high safety regimes where you've got high routine processes. So you can have a kind of checklist. If it's more idiosyncratic, then it becomes, everything needs to be much more bespoke. If you've got quantitative models, then you've got obviously new data, counted capacities, etc. And when it's outcomes focused provisions, linking back to those open-ended rules, then you've got to think about, if it's an outcomes focus, you've got to understand the logic model or the logic of change. So to achieve that outcome, I need to do the following different things, because I understand the causal relationship between all these different interventions, and I know if I do all of these different steps, I will get that outcome. That's actually a very sophisticated understanding that one needs, really, of the nature of actions and interactions and the impacts of activities, systems, and intervention. And when we move into the risk space, then moves into scenario design, stress testing, etc. A little bit out of this context here, but it's just to note. So there's all that going on. So what affects how regulatees respond or providers respond? Now, again, everybody on the call who is being regulated you can form your own little checklist on this, but some of the things that come out in the research and the literature are those you might expect, really. First of all, in no particular order, as they say on Strictly, business criticality and the compliance catalyst. So how core or peripheral is the regulatory system to the business? You know, what are the business implications of not complying and being found not to comply? How profitable is non-compliance? How likely am I to get caught? What are the sanctions? So that whole compliance calculus. External shocks can also prompt compliance where it might otherwise not have been forthcoming. So enforcement actions against a firm or another provider, either your direct provider directly or one that looks very much like them, and thinking, oh gosh, that might happen to me. need to shake up, or negative consumer reactions fueled by social media, particularly other negative market reactions from supply chain investors in different contexts, and reputational damage. You know, all those kind of external pressures can reverberate internally to affect attitudes to compliance. But also firms can generate, or operators can generate that culture internally. To what extent is there a customer, student, whatever focus? Is it a high safety environment? Is there an employee focus or not in any of those things? And the importance of leadership, obviously, and the tone from the top, either way, either pro or anti-compliance. And then there is something also which is quite interesting around regulatory and political capital, as it were. So research suggests the more confident providers firms are in their relationship with regulators, the more able they are to deal with these open-ended, principles-based, outcome-focused regulatory requirements which require negotiation with regulators, which I think is something to reflect on. And then one of the core business or operational issues for anybody interested in compliance and regulation is how integrated is it into the organizational and individual decisions at all levels, or is it just siloed? It's something just done on the side, it's something you show the regulator, actually has no implications for how anybody thinks, works, operates within the organization itself. And so there's a lot of work then done looking at organization structures and incentives, looking at pay, reward, promotion, internal cultures, power dynamics, so on and so forth. So really, obviously, big area to explore, and quite a lot of research done on that. So let's then think about what's this sort of, I've looked at both sides, as it were, how the regulator thinks about the regulatees, how the regulatees might be thinking about the regulators. Let's think about how they are interacting together, and said that was a critical element of how the system works. So, you know, again, firms will be looking, and providers could be looking at, well, are we having a close and continuous relationship here, or is it going to be a targeted, infrequent, sporadic? Thinking about characterization of the regulatee, their practical limitations, but also thinking about, from a regulatory point of view, does the regulator have a relationship policy? I often sometimes say this to regulators, and what is that? You know, are you adopting that tit for tat approach? Or are you saying, or are you giving a regulatory dividend, as it were, to those who are those compliance leaders? Do you have a policy on how you are going to relate to firms? How close is the relational distance or otherwise between supervisors? Do you have a policy on rotating people around? Do you want to really get to know your firms, or do you want to be managing them at a distance? What does that look like? What's the level of kind of shared understanding of the problems and solutions, and what do your external political environment expect? So all of those things play in, just with that there, all of those things play into this really, really quite complicated dynamic. But there are some choices that both regulators and regulatees can be making along the way, which can affect that dynamic. But it can also misfire, because regulated providers might be wanting one type of relationship, and a regulator might be not wanting that, or wanting a different type, or might just not have the resources to have a more sort of deep and close and continuous relationship that perhaps the regulatee might want. So in summary, it's all very complicated. It is and really quite varied. And obviously, as you would expect, those responses and that dynamic is shaped by a number of multiple factors, some of which I've just tried to illuminate here. And I've sort of been drawing on this. I've been talking quite general terms, but I've been drawing on this in terms of thinking these dynamics. You see at play in pretty much every regulatory system I've looked at. They are manifested differently. But if we're looking at health, safety, or environment, or looking at a risk regime, or financial services, and they'll play into the educational sector as well, and certainly across the profession. So, although one is in one's own kind of regulated sector and regulatory bubble, as it were, it's always worth looking around and thinking, well, how are these dynamics playing out in other contexts, and what can we draw from that? So I'm going to stop there, and very, very happy to take questions. So I'm just going to stop sharing now and move back. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was fascinating. And I'm afraid that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope you can all hear me okay. But Julia has very generously said she's ready to take questions. So if you have a question, then please do raise your hand and I'll come to you to unmute and pose your question, or pop a question into the chat and we can pick them up from there. So I am not seeing any hands raised at the moment. I'm going to abuse the chair and start with a question of my own, Julia, if that's okay. You touched on your little 4-piece matrix. I thought was really good, really interesting, and it talked about the sort of capacity and willingness to comply with regulation. But I wonder whether there's a view of organisations to be compliant, to be those compliance leaders that you talked about, or whether actually smaller organisations have a kind of better facility with being agile and responsive and being compliant. Is there something in there about the size of the organisation that helps compliance?
That's really, really interesting. And I think it's you're right, because it's not necessarily that the more resources helps actually in terms of size, because with size comes complexity, as we know. And yes, for the smaller organization is more agile, isn't more able to respond. Organizations, as we know, are collections of people, systems and processes. And your systems and processes can be simpler. It can be easier to develop a pro compliance culture, because it's just easier on that scale to talk to people and to have a conversation about what this means for the organization and how your organizational values can be aligned with the goals of the regulatory system, and really to own the compliance and own the goals, and see these things as being valuable in their own right and valuable for the organization itself. And as you move into, a very large organization which has got multiple, there's quite an interesting analogy in actually the sociology of the risk of safety organizations, that argues the more closely coupled an organization, the easier that is to direct and manage, because everything kind of moves together. So some people talk to me about, because I've spent some time managing in management in universities, kind of moved over to the dark side. And so if it's all closely coupled, then it's kind of, once you've got it turning, it can all turn. But if it's loosely coupled, everything's quite fragmented, you've got lots of autonomous units, then I say, well, you could be turning an oil tanker, which is hard and slow, but it's a tanker, right? Once the whole thing turns, everything turns with it, because everything's neatly joined. As I sometimes analogize managing a university to actually, it's not an oil tanker, it's a flotilla, right? And it's trying to get the flotilla to move in the same direction. And some of them are really big ships, and some of them are really tiny, and some of them are submersibles, and they're just going to disappear below the waterline, so they don't get seen and they don't get noticed. So there is something about organizational complexity, which again may or may not be related to size, that I think you're absolutely right, does mean how effective. But I think what we're coming to there is how effective is the leadership of an organization in actually getting the organization to go in a particular direction. And that requires different skills, different approaches, depending on the size and complexity of the organization. But it is by absolutely no means the case that small means you're not going to be able to do this and large means you are. Large just means you've got more resources to throw at it, but it might not be very effective. Really interesting question.
Thank you. I particularly like your description of universities as flotillas. I think that's a particularly good metaphor. We've got a couple of hands in the audience. Rob Stroud, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks, Vicky. I thought I'd take advantage of whilst yes, others hadn't yet put their hand up. Julia, that was really interesting. Thank you. I was particularly interested in what you were talking about in relation to the different sort of modes of regulation, different models of regulation, detailed rules, principles-based, outcomes-focused, etc. And I wondered if you had a view as to whether it was possible or advisable for a regulator to be more than one of those things at any one time. So, for example, could you have an outcomes-focused regulator that tried to operate a principles-based regulation system in one way, but also set down some detailed rules? Yeah. And if it is something that you consider is possible, what are your views on how those being regulated, the regulatees, might have to adapt to respond to that?
Yeah, no, really good question. So, principles-based regulation or outcomes-focused is partly a matter of kind of what your rules look like, but also very importantly, partly a dynamic and partly an approach. And there are very few regulatory systems where they are just principles. And you have a very bare rule book. We tried under the SRA to reduce what was several hundred pages down to actually just about 10 of them, and managed it there. But most of the time, and there are different reasons why that works, but most of the time you'll have principles and then or outcomes focused, but then some details as to how some detailed provisions underneath that. And then the question for I'll come on to how regulatees might respond, but the sort of design question for a regulator then, she always says, well, listen, if you think as a regulator there is only one way or two or three ways in which you would be satisfied that somebody is going to be able to demonstrate that they have treated somebody fairly, or they've given a good outcome, etc., or they've operated a safe system, put it in a detailed rule. Okay, if you really do think that, but think quite hard about what you're putting in a detailed rule and why. But there usually is a combination, and then there's always guidance as well, to come in. But what does that mean but critically what it means in spirit, as it were, or should do, for both a regulator and a regulator provider, is that you interpret those rules and those detailed rules in the light of that overall principle or outcome you want to achieve. So it's not it moves beyond a kind of a tick, and so it then gives you a sense of, well, because one of the things with detailed rules is they never meet every circumstance, right? There's always going to be a way in which it doesn't quite work, I've got to adjust, etc. And it gives you a kind of guiding star as to, well, towards what end. Right? What am I trying to achieve? So, okay, I've got to drive at 30 miles an hour. Actually, there could be at times, as we know, when 30 miles an hour is far too fast. Actually, really, what I've got to be doing is driving safely. But we need to specify what safe means at some level to give people a kind of a benchmark. So, the highway code, for example, has just introduced on the cyclists, those who are still cyclists who cycle on busy roads, cars now have to get 1.5 meter distance. Well, I mean, nobody gets their meter rule out to sort of work it out, but it sort of gives you an idea. A safe distance wasn't enough. So actually bringing in 1.5 meters is safe gives people a bit of a calibration, but it also indicates that ultimately what it's got to be is safe. So sometimes it might need to be a bit more. Or do you see what I mean? So it's about that spirit. So that is why, I am on record as favouring principles-based regulation in certain ways, with lots of different caveats and outcomes focus, for that very reason, which is it lifts you up, as it were, from the kind of the tick box, check box to actually what are we trying to achieve here? What are we collectively trying to achieve?
Thanks.
I think it can play into an organisational mission as well. Organisation can get behind it. We want to give good outcomes. It can't really get behind, we need to, follow the following process and tick the following boxes. It's hard to inspire people in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to come to Martin now, Martin Lockett.
Yeah, I've got a question about whether there's any evidence or analysis where people face multiple regulators. You've really been talking about more of a one-to-one relationship, but especially if you have anything like collaborative provision, branch campuses, you have that on a national basis, but equally in a subject area, you could have, the national educational regulation, professional bodies, etc.
Absolutely. No, you're right. So for simplicity's sake, I just assumed you have this one, but you're absolutely right. Usually, in fact, we're all facing off a number of different a number of different regulators. And as you rightly said, in the education space, I work in the banking space. You know, if you've got HSBC, it's being regulated by 140 different countries, in 140 different countries, by more than 140 different regulators. So, so what does that do? It makes the problem obviously much more complicated. And I think it then comes back to that. So how we see organisations respond comes back to that business criticality. But also the desire that businesses have, and we all, you know, quite understandably and rightly, is just to have one process that runs across, for efficiency's sake, across their different branches, organisations. So you'll find a levelling up. So this is the argument, for example, in relation to GDPR. You know, you find firms who aren't bound by GDPR but want to be doing business within the EU context. It's much easier for the rest of their systems. Unless there's a massive profit margin to be made, which there might be in GDPR in some cases, it's easier just to kind of level up and standardize to the level of the highest, actually, rather than have different patterns of regulation. But it does obviously increase the cost. It increases the complexity. Because also as a provider, you then have to get to know and understand these different regulators and what it is that it's important for them and how they operate and their different cultures, etc. And that's just that's even in relation to one area of activity. That's before we brought in the health and safety regulator, or we brought in the, you know, if it's animal experimentation, we brought in all those other different regulators as well. So it goes to, I don't think the dynamics don't, the core elements of the dynamics don't change, I don't think, all those different drivers, but you do just have, as you say, there's much more complex regulatory, more of a Rubik's Cube now, one needs to be managing than you do, as you say, in that very much quite simple framework that I put out. And I think what also is needed there, how well that works, depends on the relationship between the regulators themselves. And one of the challenges is then how important is the firm or the operator to that regulator's kind of mission. So, and that's where sort of disasters can happen as well. So there was for example, the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive are often dually responsible for the same site. But something which might pose a very high environmental risk might not be posing a very high health and safety risk. But if they're meant to be doing dual inspections, which they are in some cases, then actually the HSE doesn't want to be putting in as much resources as that as the environment regulator. And so you have a bit of a system failure as well, which can also be problematic. So you then, as I say, end up with these multiple dynamics happening at these different levels. Does that help? I probably just said it makes it all much more complicated, but it is interesting. It is important how easy it is for the firm to comply in the middle of all of this is, I think, quite heavily contingent on how the relationship is between all the other different regulators. A, whether they know each other exists. B, whether they care, and C, whether they actually want to communicate.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And yeah, as I say, at times though you get a conflict because two people want to do things different ways. That's absolutely, and it's not always possible to do the same process multiple different ways. Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Martin and Julia. I'm going to go to Rowan Fisher now. Rowan, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Julia. That was a great presentation, and I think it really helped sort of articulate a lot of things I've been thinking, but didn't quite have the sort of framework and the sort of to know sort of how to describe, you know, some of the things we're experiencing, certainly in the higher education space. One of the question I want to ask you is about sort of regulatory burden, and it's something we're hearing a lot at the moment in higher education. But I was wondering if you had any reflections on, you know, experiences of regulatory burden in other sectors and other regulators and the sort of trends there. And I guess particularly against the backdrop of risk-based regulation, which you know, in theory would adapt to different contexts. But is regulatory burden just one of those things where there's always going to be, you know, some level of burden, or has anyone sort of cracked it? Has anyone got a really good sort of proportionate model out there that seems to work for both the regulator and the regulatee? Yeah.
So I think you're really right to bring this up, actually, because I'm constantly amazed, and I'm constantly amazed at the different way in which universities or higher education providers are viewed by government than other forms of business. So compliance burden has been on a better regulation agendas list, you know, since the early 90s, and we've had successive attempts of bonfires of red tape, etc. None, you know, some of which have gone reasonably well, some of which haven't. But most regulators, and we push for this at the EU level, actually, have to at least do a cost-benefit analysis. And the cost-benefit analysis, okay, it's limited because it looks at costs of compliance usually, and then tries to weigh those up against some ill-defined benefits, which are somewhere in the future. But at least it looks at costs of compliance, right? And so that is a calculation which regulators have to do. How much is this going to cost to comply with? And what are the benefits? Now, and regulators have for years been under the PACT principles, proportional, proportionate, targeted, etc., etc. And for reasons which we probably don't have time to go into here or to explore here, that if higher education providers were being treated as the businesses they are, to be frank, then cost of compliance would be something that you would imagine certain types of government would be quite alive to and alert to. I think there's a real need for cost of compliance to become a much clearer focus. Now we know there are limits on that because firms can make it up, and you know, etc., etc. But it is true that if you are theoretically, if you are in a risk-based regulatory approach, then those costs should differ. The regulatory intensity of regulation should differ, so that those that pose lower risks, to be honest, both have less resources, less attention from the regulator, as it were. Regulators don't need to apply so much resources to them, but also, you know, arguably can be, if they're that compliance leader, they're well-intentioned, etc., can be left really, I suppose, more to get on with it because they understand particularly what these good outcomes, you know, there's an understanding of what those good outcomes are, etc. And so a risk-based approach should basically be going, I suppose, more to regulatory intensity, and to the extent that regulatory intensity and the intensity of scrutiny by the regulator and the level of kind of detailed reporting required and the attitude that the regulator takes, to the extent that they add to a burden, you know, under those models, they should be lessened. So as I say, because we've talked about, but it is absolutely something I think which is always brought to the fore in other sectors in discussions about regulation, and has not been so much brought to the fore in the context of higher education, because we're in this quasi-private public space. I could talk, happy to pick up offline on that, because I can talk for some time on it.
Thanks very much, Julia. That's really helpful.
And proportionality, I think, is, you know, regulators in other sectors are under huge scrutiny and pressure from firms to put in place regulation to justify what they do for not imposing burdens which are too great. And that's an interesting dynamic to reflect on.
Thank you, Julia. I've got no more hands up or questions in the chat. So I just wondered, how common is it for regulators to share their categorization, their compliance categorizations, and what is the kind of expected level of transparency transparency to help with the proportionality and the costs of regulation, so that a regulator can understand what intensity of compliance activity they should be pulling together and how much resource they need to be devoted to it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So usually, so as I say, so in terms of the compliance, in terms of the it varies. So in terms of the sort of that characterization of high capacity, well-intentioned, high capacity, etc. As I say, quite a lot of the time, most of those judgments are quite tacit. So they're implicit within the regulator. I did say there was a very good, there was quite a nice example actually some time ago of the Scottish Environmental Regulator. In fact, it stopped it now, but they had about 7 different categories for their firms, all of which began with C, which included the compliant, the clueless, and the criminal. And they said distinct regulatory strategies in relation to each one, which I think they then dropped for different reasons. So the regulators don't usually disclose that. The other, as I say, they don't usually disclose that to themselves or categorize firms that way to themselves in quite that way. But so there's not that much there to disclose. On the risk-based, it can be more risk-based regulation, again, can be quite tacit, and it's done at the level of the individual supervisor, or it can be centralized and made much more explicit. And sometimes then the categorization is shared with firms. Sometimes it isn't, because it just makes too much, because firms will then contest their categorization rather than kind of cracking on. So there isn't. So I think the answer to that is often not that transparent, but it might not be that transparent internally either within a regulator. So that is where, again, quite a lot of premium comes on to that dynamic I call in regulatory conversations between the regulator and the providers to, okay, well, how are we doing? Where are we in your kind of in your pecking order, as it were? How do we compare? One of the really useful things that regulators can do is that they can give relativities to providers. So they will have that aggregate level of information. And we do this in banking, for example. So we can't say, well, we can't say what other firms are doing in this space. It's all commercially confidential. It's all highly sensitive. But what we can tell you is you're in the bottom quartile, or you're in the top quartile, or these are some things that other people are doing, kind of share best practice, etc. And then that can actually be genuinely helpful, because then you actually at least know where you are compared with everybody else. To try and get that kind of information from them, and then you can be working out, well, if we're in the bottom quartile, okay, are we happy with that or are we not? And the answer might be, actually, we're happy with that because that's good enough for what we need to do.
That's great. Thank you very much, Julia. We've got a couple of minutes left. If anybody's got any last minute questions or points that they would like to make to Julia or anything. I'm seeing no hands and nothing in the chat. Well, Julia, thank you very much. That's been a genuinely fascinating discussion and some really interesting points raised. And I'm sure that everybody who's been listening has got some food for thought to take away with them. Thank you so much for your generosity and the time that you've given to this. And I hope the rest of your day passes peacefully.
And I hope the rest of the event goes well. And happy birthday again.
Thank you very much. And we will indeed have cake.
Good. Excellent. Very good. Thanks so much, everybody.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.